Disclaimer: This is a student presentation using a hypothetical scenario for educational purposes. The presenter is a student at UAMS, not a representative of the agency named in the following slides. The information contained herein does not necessarily reflect the views of said agency. Hi, my name is Zach Wary, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the endocrine disruptor exposure that you all might be potentially facing in Lonoke County. I am an environmental health specialist and I work for the Arkansas Department of Health. So here's a brief outline to help us out today. First, we'll talk about the endocrine system in general, what it is, what its components are. Then we'll move on to what endocrine disruptors are, what specific examples are of endocrine disruptors, how endocrine disruptors work and affect the endocrine system in the body. And then we'll move on to specifically endocrine disruptors in Lonoke County, so potential routes of exposure to endocrine disruptors. The most prominent endocrine disruptors that you all will most likely come across on a day-to-day basis living in this county. Next, we'll talk about specific effects on health that endocrine disruptors can have. Then we'll move on to regulation and some of the challenges that go along with that. And then we'll move on to safety, how you can prevent your exposure to endocrine disruptors, how you can help to clear endocrine disruptors from your body if you do happen to come into contact with them. So first, I'll just give a brief overview of what the endocrine system is. So the endocrine system is primarily a collection of glands that are located at various points throughout the body that produce hormones, which are circulating chemicals that carry out various functions throughout the body. They can be anywhere from metabolic to growth to a lot of cell signaling functions. They have a variety of roles. The glands are located primarily in 4 regions. First, the head, which contains, if you look in this picture on the right, the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, and the pituitary gland. Endocrine glands are also in the neck, namely the thyroid, parathyroid glands, and the thymus. They are also located in the abdomen region via the adrenal cortex, the kidney, and the pancreas. And they can also be found in the pelvis. In men, they will be in the testes, and in women, they will be in the ovaries. This is the main difference between men and women. The rest is pretty much the same in the abdomen, neck, and head. So endocrine receptors are bound by hormones via a lock and key mechanism. So the hormone will just attach to the receptor and activate some kind of process. And so this can be disrupted if, for say, another chemical gets in the way of the key, so to speak, inserting into the lock. And this is how endocrine disruptors work. So that leads us nicely into this slide where we'll talk a little bit more about endocrine disruptors. We'll first talk about the mechanism of action, kind of like what we just said. So if you look at this picture on the right, the orange thing represents a hormone, and the purple thing represents its receptor. So it'll just bind to the receptor. It'll click into place, so to speak, and carry out its downstream response, whatever that may be. The green thing represents an endocrine disruptor, which can be any kind of chemical, and there are tens of thousands of different chemicals that can be classified as endocrine disruptors that can carry out this role of binding to the receptor, and they block the hormone from binding to its receptor, and it disrupts the downstream effect. And so when endocrine disruptors bind to the receptor, they can either block the normal function of the hormone, so it turns off the pathway, or it can activate the pathway, in which case it will likely be overactivated. The most common examples of endocrine disruptors, these are just a few. Like I said, there's thousands. Dioxins, phytoestrogens, pesticides, phthalates. Pesticides, I think, are going to be the most specific to Lonoke County, given the fact that Lonoke County is such a prominent farming community. Although some of these other chemicals are found in common things like just plastic stuff that you might get from the grocery store, which can be found obviously in Lonoke County, but it can be applied to most people across the country. So now we're just going to go a little bit more into endocrine disruptors in Lonoke County specifically. I already touched on this a decent amount in the last slide, but like I said, primarily it's going to be pesticides. So limiting that will be important. They're also found in plastics, water, soil, personal care products, and etc. And I wanted to specifically put etc. on this slide just to emphasize that these chemicals are so varying in their chemical structure, meaning there are, like I said, tens of thousands of different types of chemicals, and they're also ubiquitous in the type of things that they're found in. So they're all over the environment outside, all over the environment in your home. So the list of places where you could be exposed to them is quite long. So now we'll talk just a little bit more about the effects that endocrine disruptors can have on your health. So just like the type of endocrine disruptor and the places where you can find an endocrine disruptor, the effects on health are also quite numerous. Just to name a few, the first is interference with reproduction. Developmental malformations can be seen. An increased risk for cancer can be seen. Disturbances in the immune and nervous systems can also be seen. And one important point to note is that these chemicals can be toxic at very low dosages. We will get into this a little bit more later on when we're talking about regulation, but this is especially important in pregnant women. And if you look at the top two, interference with reproduction, developmental malformations, these also have to do with pregnant women and the developing fetus in both the neonatal stage and the post-birth stage. And it is likely that endocrine disruptors have a long-term effect on the developing child's health through some sort of epigenetic mechanism, meaning that even when there is the child is no longer exposed to the endocrine disruptor that was giving him this trouble in the first place, the effects can still be seen downstream. And just a few more of those effects that can be seen. So on the bottom right of the picture on the right, you can see, just to name a few, obesity, changes in metabolism, thyroid dysfunction, pubertal variants, neurobehavioral disorders such as autism, which obviously can be very genetic, but they can also be epigenetic. And then once the child develops into an adult, it can also have effects on fertility, still obesity, metabolism, thyroid functions are still a common theme throughout this cycle. And then carcinogenesis becomes a more prominent problem whenever the individual gets older. So now moving on, we'll talk a little bit about regulation. And regulation of endocrine disruptors is very challenging, mainly because they're so ubiquitous, they're such a wide variety of chemicals. They are contained at such, or they're toxic at such low dosages, like we talked about earlier. These all make it hard. They're contained in food, which makes them difficult to get rid of. They're also contained in different, like we talked about earlier, household objects such as plastics and common items that you would buy at a grocery store. And for these reasons, they're difficult to regulate. And so there isn't any current law that explicitly address endocrine disruptors. There is a program called the Endocrine Disruptor Screening Program, or the EDSP, which has got through 87,000 chemicals so far. They're still working, and they are collecting a lot of information, but no legal action has been taken as of yet. Another thing I wanted to mention as far as regulation goes, and this also has to do with just education about endocrine disruptors, is this organization called the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, or TEDx, and they're compiling a database about endocrine disruptor just information in general, and we'll talk a little bit more about them on the next slide. So like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the Endocrine Disruptor Exchange, or TEDx. They are compiling data and information, precautionary advices, just an overall broad overview of what endocrine disruption is and how it might affect you. So I would recommend checking out their website. It's here on the right, endocrinedisruption.org. One thing that they talked about in a YouTube video that I have linked down here at the bottom is what regulatory agencies must do to be effective, because there are no legal regulatory agencies right now. Potentially following these guidelines could help us to establish one. So the first one is dose, and it's important to test for endocrine disruptors at dosages comparable to the toxic dosages. This may seem intuitive, but because endocrine disruptors are toxic at such low dosages, some of the current testing options test at higher dosages than is toxic. And so they may miss an individual who has been exposed to endocrine disruptors but doesn't quite have enough of it in his or her system to be picked up by the test. The second thing is time. So there are specific windows where testing is most beneficial, and this is most likely during the prenatal development, because like we talked about, this has a lot of potency to pregnant women. And then the long-term effects as well. So this just goes back to the epigenetic influence. And so the more we can learn about the epigenetic influences, the more likely we are to get some effective regulation on endocrine disruptors. So all that being said, what can you do? So the first thing I wanted to mention, and that is because this pertains to you guys the most, is to limit pesticide use if at all possible. Pesticides have chemicals beyond just endocrine disruptors that can be detrimental to health, and so as much limitation as possible would be good. They can also build up in the soil of the farms where the pesticides are used the most, and they can especially be where the water runs off in those areas. And so avoiding water and avoiding those areas in general, and ingestion of any kind would be important. Endocrine disruptors can also build up in the environment from incomplete burning of fossil fuels. I should have touched on this a little bit earlier, but it's still worth mentioning that limiting consumption of fossil fuels will prove beneficial for this reason. Also, just in general, because they're so ubiquitous throughout the environment, wash hands, keep living quarters tidy and clean. Those are primarily ways to avoid getting exposed to endocrine disruptors. Now, moving on to what you can do potentially if you are exposed, outside of going to your doctor and heeding the advice of your primary care physician, what you can do throughout your lifestyle is to maintain a healthy diet, exercise, things like that, to help the body be as healthy as possible and to rid itself of toxins. And then limit the use of plastics. This is one of the one of the biggest things that endocrine disruptors are found in, and so limiting that use will be beneficial where at all possible. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to take them now. So, and this slide and the next have a list of my references if you are interested. And these obviously are just the latter 4 of my 8 references. Thank you very much.